Studies, member of, was the head of a Gov Center. He's a senior researcher in BESA. Wrote a lot about Jewish political tradition, the three crowns. His last book is about Israel and its army. He works a lot about the question of religious people and the army in Israel and the different sorts of army that we have in democratic society. Professor Stuart, Cohen, please.
Thank you very much indeed. First of all, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me. Slight problem that they put me after two giants in the field. And, must have known, I think it's Falstaff who says in Henry IV Part 2, when the giants do play, lesser mortals better run away. Well, I'm a lesser mortal, but I'm going to stay here just the same. I'm also endangering the necks of my fellow panelists because I have a slight show here. So if it, by the way, if anybody in the audience is like me suffers from a back problem, would like to stand up for a minute, then you can do it on my time. I mean, it's all right. Stand up, stretch, it's all you like. I don't do it. A couple of years ago, 2009. A minor storm erupted in Israel, as these things do from time to time, with the publication of a Hebrew book entitled Torat HaMelech, the Law of the King, King being God Almighty, which was written by two rabbis, Yitzchak Shapira and Yosef Elitzur, who teach at an institution in Shiva called Od Yosef Chai, which is led by one of the more prominent of the right wing in religious circles. This institution was for many years situated in Shechem in Nablus, and the year 2000, next to the reputed tomb of Joseph, and since the year 2000 it's been situated in Yitzhak. Now, the content of that book was it purported to discuss what does the Halacha, the Jewish law, have to say about the distinction between Jewish, there's a murder that's going to be committed unless these telephones stop ringing.
Question if it's proportional.
Yeah, it's going to be very, very proportional. Believe me, I'm taking no risks in it. What does Halacha, Jewish law, have to say about the distinction between Jewish and non-Jewish blood? That was the point of the book. And it focused, in fact, on some of the things which we discussed. Now, collateral killing. Now, there was an outcry, and the authors were arrested in the dead of night, and some of the people who wrote letters of approbation for this volume were also arrested in them. When they didn't turn up to court, they were going to be tried for contempt of court. And then a battle of books ensued, where some people wrote pamphlets and books in support of this book, Torat HaMelech, saying, what do you want? They just quote classical Jewish sources, and others said, well, they misinterpreted Jewish sources. In fact, one prominent rabbi came out with a statement that the book ought to be burnt, which, given the connotation of burning of books in Jewish history, is really something quite radical. Now, before getting into the content of that debate, I'd just like to point out the significance of the fact that it's taking place at all, or they took place at all. After all, since the failure of the Bar-Ilan rebellion, which is almost 2,000 years ago, there have been two cardinal rules of Jewish public life. One is that Jews don't become soldiers. Jews don't participate in military activity. The second rule is that Jews don't discuss military activity, certainly not in public. So, although throughout this period, 2,000 years in diaspora, Jews did develop what our late lamented colleague, Professor Daniel Elazar, first called, I think, Jewish political tradition, which Bar-Ilan has been fully documented, or is being fully documented by Professor Holzer. Jews certainly possess a Jewish political tradition, but certainly not a Jewish military tradition. So that even when we add up all the scattered references to warfare in the great formative codes of written by medieval Jewry and Chaim Bar-Ilan sort of pioneering study of and collected many of these materials. But even when we add them all up, and include even Maimonides, who was the only real authority to tackle the subject with coherence, what we have is really very, very sparse. And certainly nothing to compare to the great Muslim traditions with regard to warfare, and certainly not to the great Christian, majestic Christian traditions of just, unjust wars, Yus ad Belem, Yus in Belem, and only in fact at the beginning of the 20th century, where did any real investigation begin amongst rabbinic authorities as to what warfare might entail, and what a Jewish code of warfare might look like. And the elder Rabbi Cook, of course, was one of the forerunners of this. But even so, we don't really possess. And this book, Torah HaMelech, purported to state and put down and present us with precisely such a code. Now, I just might point out at this stage that this book is not easy to come by, understandably, given its nature. To the great credit of Bar-Ilan University, there is a copy in Bar-Ilan's library. However, it's in the special collection. So, alongside such things as erotica in ancient Greece or something like that. So you need to get special permission to go and have a look at it. There's a very nice gentleman there who's in charge of the special collection, and I read him, and he allowed me to Xerox the entire volume, and here it is. And so I've spent some time reading it. And with regard to our subject of self-defense, whether by democracies or not, the argument which the authors of this particular book would make, in fact do make, is that the answer is pretty straightforward. And all that needs to be said was said about almost 1,000 years ago by this titanic figure, can you read that? Maimonides, in his great code, The Laws of Kings and Their Wars, when he codified what was a Talmudic distinction between two categories of wars, mandatory wars and licensed or optional wars, and included in the category of mandatory wars was quite clearly a war to help Israel.
The lights, I mean, you cannot see it.
So I have to ask for some assistance. All right, any better?
Speak, Stuart.
No. So included in that category of mandatory wars is a war to help Israel from the oppressor attacking them. So it's a war of self-defense or a war to assist. Now, this is mandatory, by the way. Mr. Rosshandler pointed out this morning that there is not only a right to self-defense, which is Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, there's also a duty of self-defense, and this would seem to say the same thing. And there are two implications from that. That first of all, such a war can be fought by executive fiat. There's no reason to go through procedures or consultation. And second of all, and this is the point made in this book, that it can be fought without limitations. So many of the arguments that we've heard, with all due respect, today from Professor Kasher, Professor Walter, problems about proportionality, about risk, about responsibility, about necessity, they're really almost slightly marginal, if not irrelevant. The basic distinction is not, as the Western tradition has it, between combatants and non-combatants, but between Jew and non-Jew. And so you're asking whose life is more important. Now, I'm certainly not going to pass an opinion of a rabbi, or the son of a rabbi, although I'm the father of one rabbi, but never that so. I'm not going to pass an opinion about that debate. What I'd like to do, in the few minutes remaining, is just to put forward what I think is a framework for understanding the attitudes, modes of analysis, which have brought about this particular way of thinking, and other ways of thinking about war in Halacha. In doing this, I've been very influenced by a book written by Oren Gross and Fiona Niola, Law in Times of Crisis, which doesn't talk about Jewish and Israel or anything like that at all, It's to do with American emergency powers and so on. And I would suggest that there are 4 frameworks which we can posit. One I call regularization, the second regulation, the third meta-halachic, and the fourth extra-halachic. And let me say what I mean by each. Regularization, as I've written here, is halachic principles developed in civilian contexts are co-opted into the military setting. This, by the way, I want to say that these are not necessarily chronological developments. In other words, I don't think that contemporary halakha has moved from regularization to regulation and so on and so forth. It's back and forth, back and forth. But there is some sense of progression. And this stage of regularization is the earliest. What does regularization mean? I'll give an example here of pursuer. Over the years, halakha has developed an extremely cohesive, I think very understandable, very detailed set of regulations as to what to do in circumstances where one individual is running after another individual with a knife in his hand. What are the rights of the person who is being pursued? What are the duties of the onlooker? What action can you take? And one of the strategies, intellectual strategies, adopted by rabbis when confronted with situations of war is to say, well, warfare is simply this situation of a pursuer writ large. It's not an individual running after me with a knife, but a community that's running after me with a knife. A nation, an army. And so whatever I could do in a personal context, I can now transfer to a communal context. And the same rules would apply. Now, of course, the beauty of that strategy is that one doesn't have to invent a new way of halachic analysis. It's already been done, albeit in a civilian context. And the same would apply to the saving of life. Whether one is permitted to fight or not fight, use weapons and so on the Sabbath. Well, if you're permitted to do anything to save life on the Sabbath, in a civilian context, then of course one can also fight on the Sabbath in self-defense in order to save life. And so that is one strategy. A second strategy I call regulation. This recognizes that warfare must be something intrinsically different from a civilian situation. The sheer act of killing. We don't call it murder, we call it killing. And if somebody commits murder, we punish them. If somebody kills in warfare, we can give them a medal. Well, there's something different about warfare. And so we have to say that the halachic principles, which are military-related commands, or derived from military commands, and they're given a status as an autonomous corpus. Now, for instance, not only killing, but self-endangerment. One of the great rules of Jewish life is to preserve one's life. And questions are asked. So then, under what circumstances, what gives the medic a right to endanger his life in order to enter a minefield in order to save the life of a wounded soldier? Jewish, non-Jewish, we'll leave aside for them. And what are the halachic justifications? Now, under this way of thinking, the halachic justification is, well, warfare is a special situation. And if you want to transfer it to the Sabbath, fighting on the Sabbath or permission to fight on the Sabbath, weapons on the Sabbath, doesn't derive from the old rules of pikuach nefesh, saving of life. But it derives from a special verse, which is a bit technical, it relates to something in Deuteronomy chapter 20, which refers specifically, which has been interpreted to refer specifically to fighting on the Sabbath. It's a corpus all of its own. A third strategy is to appeal to meta-halachic principles, which is quite common in various fields. For instance, we know that meta-halachic principles are referred to in the form of medical ethics with regard to kvod habriyot, the dignity of the human person, or mipnei darkei shalom, for the sake of peace and so on. Now here we can refer to such again, meta-halachic principles which have no specific halachic rules attached to them, of which the most important are sanctification of the divine name or desecration of the divine name. In other words, one says that even were strict halakha to permit me to do such and such, or to forbid me to do such and such, when involved in a war-like situation, I also have to ask, beyond the strict letter of the law, how does this relate to an overriding consideration? Some could be, how would it look to the nations around? Which is, by the way, the original source for Chilul Hashem, desecration of the name. Why was Joshua allowed not to slay the Gibeonites after he discovered they tricked him? Because it wouldn't have looked nice. What would other nations have said? It would have been a Chilul Hashem. So he should have done it, but he didn't do it because, or we could say, that's the preservation of the entirety of the country, of the land of Israel. Is a sanctification of the land. If you see the conflict, as many do, between Israel and Palestinians as a conflict ultimately between Islam and Judaism, then any tolerance, any concession to the other side would in fact be a desecration of the divine name, and so on and so forth. So here we have another way of thinking, and there's a fourth way of thinking, which I call extra halachic, which is where halachic authorities will defer to non-halachic expertise. That there are situations which they say, well, halacha really has to, in some respects, give or assign to non-halachic authorities the right of making a decision. This could be with regard to doctors, as certain medical situations. Am I allowed to fast on Yom Kippur? Not allowed to fast on Yom Kippur? And in military situations too. There was one of the seminal articles in this particular field was written in 1953 by Rabbi Israeli in response to the Kibbutz massacre, Kibbutz incident, 1953. And Rabbi Israeli writes a very intricate article. It goes through how can we justify the Israeli action, which involved the deaths of several dozen Palestinian non-combatants in an IDF operation. How can this be justified by or can it be justified by Halacha? And he goes through various arguments, and in the end, his final argument is, well, you know, a war that is conducted according to accepted international standards is permissible, according to the Torah, by virtue of the principle, which is, again, an extra halachic principle. Dina de malchuta dina. The law of the land is in. And he says, well, if the Americans could incinerate men, women and children in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then why shouldn't we do the same to Palestinians? These are international standards. And so we go to extra. Now, I think that each of these strategies, frameworks, involves different intellectual exercises. Clearly, regularization, where I simply take civilian principles and apply them, is, I call it transfer. Regulation is far more intricate. It's an archaeological exercise. You have to discover or rediscover what might have been Judaism intention with regard to warfare. Meta-halachic, one has to, I call it accommodation. Halacha has to accommodate itself to general principles. And extra halachic, this is deference. Halacha defers to non-halachic authority. Now all this is a bit, I think, sort of provincial and concerned solely with Yiddish. I think there is, however, and this I'll conclude, Mr. Chairman, there is, however, one other aspect, dimension to this, which might have wider relevance for the purposes of this conference. And that is, what is the focus of analysis? I think regularization, the focus of analysis is either the individual, which is where, for instance, the pursuer, the Rodef analogy stems from, or at most a community, a settlement, a township. That is the focus of analysis, and in fact it's It grew out of a diaspora situation. That's one area of self-defense. What are we defending? Are we defending the individual or the community? I think the second regulation is involved with the defense of the community, but also I think of the polity. There's a recognition here that there is such a thing as a Jewish state, which also has to be defended, and not only the citizens of the state, but the state itself has a right to defense. The third, meta-halachic, where you take into account general considerations. I think there is here a consideration not only of this state, but also the interests of the Jewish collectivity at large. How will Jews appear? Which has also always been a factor in, by the way, in Israel's foreign policy. And finally, the extra halachic, not only the Jewish collectivity, but also to some extent, to what extent are we furthering the interests of humanity at large by acting in one way or another, which will call for argument's sake more. Now, I think this is an ongoing debate between different schools of thought. This book, Torat HaMelech, was simply one incident in this debate. Certainly didn't end the debate, on the contrary, it accentuated the debate. And I think the debate is of intrinsic interest. I think the outcome of that debate, or the way it's conducted, might also be of moral interest in the fibre of Israeli society. Thank you.